I am Commodore Uday Bhaskar, retired. I was formerly the head of the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi. I was also the member secretary of a task force that the Government of India had set up on global strategic developments. And the chairman for this task force was India's most eminent strategic and security analyst, Mr. K. Subramaniam. Over the years, I've also been looking at the India-US relationship with special reference to the nuclear issue.
So, Commander Bhaskar, you just are returning from Pentagon. So, tell me, what's the mood in Pentagon over the US-India nuclear deal being slashed at this point?
Well, let me put it this way, that there is a certain amount of disappointment in most quarters in the United States, especially in the US government, amongst those people who had worked very hard to take the July 2005 agreement forward. Now, the domestic debate in India, the politics in India, has clearly stalled the so-called nuclear deal. This is because my sense is that there is a certain amount of hesitation, a certain amount of reticence in India about engaging with the United States in the first instance, and secondly, a certain inability to assess the strategic contours of the 21st century and be able to come to an objective determination about what are the opportunities that India can now avail of because of July 2005, and what are the various challenges that India would have to address in the course of the next 5 to 10 years. So to that extent, I believe that the inadequacy of the Indian political establishment and the so-called bureaucratic elite in India at this point in time is causing considerable dismay, because Mr. Bush, the US President, and his team had invested a lot of effort and innovative thinking to make July 2005 happen, which is to say that India was to be accorded this exceptionalism.
Now, do you see a kind of a loss of confidence among the US policymakers in this matter? I mean, of course, I think US policymakers were very upbeat 2 years back when Manmohan Singh declared that deal, and over the time it has declined very sharply. Do you see how the mood is being reflected in Pentagon? I mean, from
well, I would say that the current mood in the US security establishment is that India is not yet ready to assume the kind of role that India was seeking. And this is more a reflection about the inadequacy on the Indian side. Because if you recall the July 2005 agreement, it was preceded by June 2005, an agreement signed by Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, who was then the Indian Defense Minister, and Mr. Donald Rumsfeld, the US Defense Secretary. Now that was a very ambitious agreement, and in a way it was providing an opportunity for the Indian military to come out of the isolation that had been imposed on it by way of access to high technology. Now, July 2005 was enabling India to engage with the rest of the world and the United States in particular in the high technology commerce. So the sense one gets in the interactions in the United States is that India, which had exuded such impressive potential, for instance, if you talk about Davos, the entire flavor was that India is this rising great power. Now the sense is that India is not yet ready, and that the Indian political establishment is unable to arrive at a consensus for reasons that are not valid. I mean, that is what is very anguishing, that if you look at the nature of the debate in India now, the reason for opposing July 2005 is not based on really valid reasons. The only party that has taken a position that you might describe as consistent is the Communist parties of India, the so-called left parties. But that is driven by ideology. They are very clear. They say that they do not want India to get into a closer relationship with the United States because of, quote unquote, the nature of the imperial power. But on tangibles, I mean, one big thing which I have been talking about in many places is that India is going to be in a very, very severe uranium fuel crisis situation.
I think it is already in crisis, because for the last 4 years we have no supply of uranium in Tarapur plant.
When many of our reactors are now operating at less than optimum plant load factors. We are now coming down to almost 50-60%.
I mean, let's recap the whole thing. I mean, we know, you mentioned a very good point. We know that there is absolutely no substantial fact for opposition, even, when we did a great deal of research on that, and we know that. And as you rightly pointed out, it's a completely ideological opposition, which may exist in a democracy. I won't say in a democracy it will be all fair game. But tell me, even despite these differences, this strategic loss of image that you just described, how much it will cost in terms of India's aspiration to secure the permanent seat in Security Council? Because India has been seeking a seat in Security Council, and perhaps now the world leadership might think Indian political system is still immature to give them that kind of status.
Well, I think that India's claim to be perceived or recognized as a credible power, as an emerging great power, as a legitimate candidate for a seat on the United Nations Security Council will all take a beating. Because today I think the perception in all capitals of the world, major capitals of the world, is that India is not yet ready to assume this role of a great power that it has been seeking, particularly as far as this seat on the permanent council of the security, or the permanent seat on the Security Council is concerned. And that, I think, is what is cause for dismay, which is that India had an opportunity through the July 2005 agreement to come out of the isolation that had been imposed on it, and full marks must be given to both US President Mr. Bush and Dr. Manmohan Singh for coming up with this very innovative agreement. If July 2004 does not go through, and today, in the middle of May, I am also less optimistic than I was a few weeks ago, my sense, my conclusion, or what I'm driving at, is to say that India is going to remain subaltern in Asia.
But are you happy with the role of Congress in this matter? I mean, we know the leftist has taken clear opposition stand from ideological standpoint, but if you look at Congress politics, initially Mr. Singh was at the helm of affair, and after that he was replaced by Poonam Mukherjee to handle the deal in terms of this political coalition or whatever, the political review committee for the deal. And once Mr. Mukherjee came in, he rather went out for a stalemate rather than actually pushing the deal forward, which is very clear, and he made it clear as well. Do you think it was the right thing to do from his point of view, he being the whole responsible person for India's foreign relationship?
My personal assessment is that the Congress was perhaps more cautious and timid than it needed to be. Because from July 2005, if you look at the way in which this agreement has moved and the way in which the US Congress had passed the Hyde Act with the equivalent of bipartisan support, I would make a case to say that the Congress government in India and the major allies, because let's remember that the UPA is a coalition. The left parties are only supporting this coalition. Yes, the BJP, the principal opposition party, has also played a role that would be described as far from helpful. But I would make a case, I'm not a political analyst, but I would still make a case to say that Dr. Manmohan Singh and Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, let it not be forgotten, who is the Congress president, could have taken a call to say that they will go ahead with this deal, because as Mr. Brijesh Mishra, our former national security advisor, had pointed out, India is a parliamentary democracy. And to that extent, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet have the right, the legislative right, to go ahead with such agreements. But at the same time, I would add a caveat, which is to say that the parliamentary form of government would also expect a certain degree of consensus in terms of the legislative support. So where I would really say that the Congress was perhaps remiss is that from July 2005 onwards, they did not create the kind of support that was required, which means that the Congress should have engaged in what you might describe as strategic communication with the country. I think they did not package this deal as persuasively, as effectively, and they did not create this body of opinion in India to really explain what was at stake. And towards the end, I'd like to say this as objectively as I can, that the BJP, led by Mr. Advani, has taken a position that is going to put India's security interests in grave jeopardy in the years ahead, particularly as far as the nuclear option is concerned.